Hello, my name is Ghinwa Hakim, and you are watching the Arabic Hour.
Palestinians voted the wrong way in a free election. Okay, therefore they have to be punished. I mean, that's so obvious that you can't even find a comment about it in the press or anywhere else because it's obvious. You vote the wrong way in a free election, you have to be punished. Okay, that's democracy. That's just more of those.
On today's program, we are on location at Boston University, where the Massachusetts chapter of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee co-sponsored with the Arab Students Association of Boston University an event on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Speakers were Professor Noam Chomsky and Executive Director of the Massachusetts chapter of the ADC, Omar Baddar. The lecture was focused on presidential elections, the Iraqi surge, and current U.S. policy towards the Middle East. Professor Chomsky opened the event with a discussion, followed by a special mini-debate between Professor Chomsky and Omar Baddar, with perspectives on the Israel lobby. The Arabic Hour will be bringing you the program in its entirety in two separate programs. On today's program, we will be listening to Professor Noam Chomsky on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Without further delay, let us now watch Professor Chomsky's presentation.
Well, we're in the middle of the quadrennial extravaganza, and there's no way to avoid it, so might as well formulate the question at hand as what are the prospects for U.S. policy in the Middle East with a new administration. But before going into that, I'd like to say a word on how the concept of democracy is conceived across elite circles in the United States. There was a good characterization of this from the White House a week or so ago. The Dana Perino, the White House spokesperson, was asked by journalists why the government, the administration, is pursuing so vigorously an extended war in Iraq when the population strongly opposes it. And her answer was, you had your input. The American people have input every 4 years. That's the way the system is set up, which is correct. Every 4 years, you have a choice between candidates whose views you oppose, as we know well from extensive studies of public opinion. And after you've gone through that exercise, you shut up until you have the same opportunity 4 years later. Well, it should be recognized that this is not a right-wing position. This is a consensus position. So if we move over to the sort of progressive side of the spectrum, pick the leading figure in American journalism in the 20th century, one of the most respected public intellectuals, Walter Lippmann, who was also a prominent theorist of democracy. He's kind of a Wilson, Roosevelt progressive. He was much sharper than Dana Perino. He described the population as ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who have to be put in their place, and their place is spectators, not participants, while the responsible men, us smart guys, run the affairs of state. So yes, shut up, not only between the 4 year periods, but at the moment when you push the button as well. And he could have given, I don't think he did, good constitutional sources for that. It was pretty much James Madison's point of view. The main framer of the Constitution, his view was that power should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, the most responsible set of men, those who have sympathy with property owners and their rights, and who can perform the duty of government, namely to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And there's this is a constitutional convention. It's not what you read in high school when you're learning about the founding fathers, but it's fundamentally the point of view. There is disagreement. I don't want to suggest that it's consensus. There's overwhelming opposition to this view among the general public, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. And we know that very well. In fact, there was just a series of polls taken, released a week or so ago, by the most respected institution that studies public opinion, Program on International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland, domestic and international. And they found that 94% of the public disagree radically with this position and think that the government should attend to public opinion, not just every 4 years, but all the time, which is another bit of evidence that they are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. And the public has no illusions about how the government is run. So the same polls reveal that 80% of the public hold that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves and not for the benefit of the population. So there is, in effect, agreement across the board. There's agreement across the elite spectrum, including the population, as to how the government is run. And the only difference is that the public deplores it, and educated people like you are supposed to approve of it. But otherwise, there is agreement. This batch of polls, as I say, was released about a week ago. There was another poll included in the collection. It was a poll on Chinese repression in Tibet. And I'll leave it to you to guess which one of these polls was actually reported in the news and to draw the obvious conclusions from that. Let's ask how this general consensus on functioning democracy fares with regard to our question. What are the prospects for U.S. Middle East policy with the new administration? As far as McCain is concerned, I suspect he's the likely victor. Policies will be apparently much the same, maybe more extreme insofar as we can determine his positions. So let's turn to the Democrats. First of all, what is policy? Actually, we know it very well, at least if you do a small research project. The policy of the Bush administration as intentions, and presumably McCain, were made very clear last November in a White House declaration. White House now produced a declaration, a Bush-Maliki declaration. Maliki is what's called the government of Iraq. That's established inside the Green Zone, the heavily protected area of Iraq that's run by the United States. His writ doesn't extend very far beyond that. According to Patrick Coburn, a recent book, one of the very few Westerners who has any intimate knowledge of Iraq, he's universally loathed in the country, but loved by Washington. So that's the Iraqi government. Bush and Maliki produced a declaration in which they said that U.S. forces will remain indefinitely for two purposes. The first purpose is to deter foreign aggression. The only threat of aggression against Iraq is the United States and maybe Israel, and that's certainly not what they intended. But anyway, one goal is to deter foreign aggression, and the second is internal security. And that does not mean internal security for a government that would, say, call for the U.S. to leave or otherwise resist U.S. domination. The declaration also covered economic policy. It said Iraq must facilitate and encourage foreign investment, especially American investment. Now, that's pretty brazen. Things are rarely said that clearly. Meanwhile, the government also announced that they would insist that Baghdad should give U.S. authority, the United States authority to conduct combat operations. And just to underscore all of this, Bush, in one of his hundreds of signing statements, which are covered in the press, actually by one journal, the Boston Globe. Charlie Savage of the Boston Globe has been reporting these for some years. Virtually no one else has. These are statements in which the president signs legislation and then says, I'm not going to live up to it for these reasons. Bush has signed hundreds of these, probably close to 1,000 by now, way more than all other presidents in history. Usually they're given for clarification. In this case, the Bush signing declaration in January said that he would reject any congressional legislation, including the one he just signed, that interferes with establishing military bases for the permanent stationing of U.S. forces in Iraq, or legislation that inhibits exercising U.S. control of the oil resources of Iraq. In short, Iraq is to remain a U.S. client state, permanent military occupation. That doesn't mean troops all over the place. It could be like, say, Vichy France, which was run by the French police and army, not by the Germans in the background. It will remain under that kind of occupation, and the United States will control its oil resources and will privilege U.S. energy corporations. That's actually, most of that was pretty obvious all along. This is a little more extreme than what the harshest critics had maintained. But there's no need to debate it any longer because it's been announced from the highest source. And as I said, you can find out about it if you do a research project. Most of this was not reported. Well, that's the Bush-McCain position. What about the Democrats? A year ago, last March, the Democratic-controlled Congress did produce a withdrawal proposal, and it was analyzed by General Kevin Ryan, who was at the time a senior fellow at the Harvard University Kennedy School Belfer Center for International Affairs. And he pointed out that the Democratic proposal had a number of qualifications. One was that the president was able to waive any restrictions in the case of national security. Well, that opens the door to anything. That's a permanent exception to any kind of withdrawal. Secondly, U.S. forces, though they were to be withdrawn sooner or later, would remain for special missions. The special missions were three. One, combating terrorism, which again is open-ended. Two, training Iraqi forces, again open-ended. And third, protecting U.S. facilities, citizens, and forces. Well, what are U.S. facilities? Well, first of all, they include the huge military bases that are being built around the country, not with the intention of being dismantled, of course. One of them, the Balad base right north of Baghdad, is described by observers there as probably the busiest aircraft facility in the world. And that's one that'll have to be protected, and there are several others around the country. We really don't know how many because it's kept more or less quiet. They're not called permanent bases. The preferred Orwellism these days is enduring bases. So they'll endure as long as the U.S. wants them to. At the end of time, they may disappear. So they'll protect and the other facility that has to be protected is an object which is called the embassy. This is nothing like any embassy in the world or in history. It's a city, a self-contained city inside the green zone, which is going to be protected by Americans, and with everything from McDonald's to missile defense systems.
You are watching a lecture by Professor Noam Chomsky, which is part of a presentation on U.S. policy in the Middle East, which took place at Boston University on April 3rd. We'll be back to Professor Chomsky after this short program ID. You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To watch today's program or any of our previous programs, log on to www.arabic.hour.org. And now, back to our program.
City in the city called the Green Zone, and American forces and any other Americans that are there Protecting American forces is no small job. If any American forces remaining have any contact with Iraqis, the majority of the Iraqi population thinks they're fair game for attack, so they'll need a lot of protection. Well, after running through this, General Ryan concludes that what the Democrats are proposing is not withdrawal, but should be called remissioning, which may leave roughly the same number of forces with a different mission. The Obama-Clinton proposals today are kind of not very explicit, but it's hard to see much difference between the current ones and the one that was in fact proposed by the Democrat-run Congress. So I think that's, incidentally, this omits quite a lot. It omits any reference to the mercenaries, who are about at the same level as U.S. forces at the moment. It omits problems of logistics and supply, which are huge. Most of the supply of these forces and the operations, including the enduring military bases, comes from Kuwait through pretty dangerous territory, as we just saw last week. And that, again, is going to involve plenty of force. And it omits bombing. Those of you who remember or who have read about the several years of slow withdrawal of U.S. troops from Indochina will recall that that was accompanied by a rapidly escalating bombing. It had already been horrendous, got much worse in the last couple of years, mostly in northern Laos, and then even worse in Cambodia. In Cambodia alone, as we have just learned, bombing was in the early 70s was at 5 times the horrifying level that had been reported at the time, greater than all bombing in all theaters during World War II. This is rural Cambodia, where, apart from carrying out indescribable destruction, it essentially organized the Khmer Rouge, which had been a marginal force before, but was joined by huge numbers of enraged peasants with consequences that we know. Well, that's the bombing part is not mentioned, or also the more advanced form of state terror that are available to high-tech advanced terror states, like the United States and Israel particularly. That's one example of that. A few months ago was when a U.S. Predator, a drone, bombed a target in Pakistan, apparently aiming at some presumed al-Qaeda leader, but hit a school, madrasa, and killed 80 to 85 people in the school, which is what's called collateral damage, and didn't arouse much interest here, but has the obvious consequences in Pakistan. This is standard Israeli policy, goes on all the time. So that kind of terror is also not mentioned. In any event, it seems that there's very little reason to think that there'll be very much change in policy with regard to Iraq. The Democrats are likely to be less brazen, more toward the center, standard center, than the Bush administration, but otherwise not particularly different. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that there simply is no principled opposition to the Iraq invasion. When I say no, I mean no. Try to find it. By that I mean the kind of opposition that was reflexive when the Russians invaded Afghanistan or when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. We didn't say at that time that the Russians or Saddam had committed a strategic blunder. That's Obama's criticism of the invasion of Iraq, or that they had entered a civil war that they could not win, Clinton's objection to the war in Iraq. And incidentally, the civil war we initiated, and Iraqis insist on that. But that was not the kind of criticism that was given of, say, the Russian or the Saddam Hussein's invasion or anybody else's invasion, only ours. When we invade, it's a blunder at worst. And the Vietnam War was exactly the same. It's worth remembering that. Years and years of massive discussion of the Vietnam War, but you really have to search hard to find a principled objection. What you found at the sort of critical extreme, won't sample the rest, was someone like, say, Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, about at the end of imaginable criticism in the mainstream. At the end of the war, 1975, when he reviewed what had happened, he said the war had begun with blundering efforts to do good, which I should say is essentially a tautology. Since we carried it out, it was efforts to do good. That part's tautologous, doesn't matter what the facts are. And it was blundering because it didn't work. So it began with blundering efforts to do good, essentially vacuous. But he said by 1969, it had become clear that we could not carry out our goal of creating a liberal democracy in Vietnam at a cost acceptable to ourselves. The goal is more doctrinal orthodoxy, but the crucial part is it's just costing us too much. Well, that's about the limits of possible criticism. Again, apart from the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. In 1969, about 70% of them described the war as not a mistake, but fundamentally wrong and immoral. And that figure remains up to the most recent polls. But again, they're supposed to be spectators, not participants in a functioning democracy. So their position doesn't matter. Well, if there's no principled opposition, and you carry over the same discussion to the war in Iraq, almost identical words. So without any principled opposition, there's no particular reason to expect a serious change in policy. Well, let's turn to Iran, the next major issue, and a very serious one. If the U.S. does attack Iran, nobody wants to predict what could happen. Well-known British military historian Corelli Barnett said it'll be World War III, whatever it'll be pretty awful. Well, the Bush administration is now being praised for its moves towards diplomacy instead of just violence, and Condoleezza Rice is credited with this, and it is praised very much here, not elsewhere. So not, for example, in Saudi Arabia, which is known for its deference to U.S. leaders and its general politeness to foreign visitors. Bush was just there, and as he left, he was greeted with an editorial in the leading Saudi English language newspaper about his diplomatic efforts, and they said, American policy is not diplomacy in search of peace, but madness in search of war. Well, another way of looking at it, so you take your choice. What do the Democrats say about this? Well, here's Obama. He says he would go. He's accused of going too far. Here's how far he would go. He would offer economic inducements and a possible promise not to seek regime change in Iran if Iran dropped its meddling in Iraq and cooperated on matters of terrorism and nuclear weapons. In that case, there's a possible promise not to carry out regime change. So let's carry out a thought experiment. I suppose tomorrow Ahmadinejad makes a speech in which he says that he would offer economic inducements to Israel and a possible promise not to seek regime change in Israel if Israel stops its many crimes and accepts the long-standing Iranian proposal for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the entire region, including Iran and Israel. So in that case, he would offer a possible promise not to try to overthrow the government. Well, I'll leave it to you to figure out how we'd react to that and what that implies. Incidentally, the concept meddling in Iraq is a kind of an interesting one. You can find analogs. Like, say, the Nazis in occupied Europe accused the Allies correctly of meddling in places like Vichy France, that's carrying out terror. In fact, it sometimes reaches pretty extreme levels. Other countries are beginning to borrow U.S. government and standard commentary, the rhetoric that's being produced. So take the notion enemy combatant. Enemy combatant today means say a 15-year-old kid who throws a stone at an American soldier in invading his country. That's an enemy combatant. Go to Guantanamo, CNDU. Other countries are picking it up. So the government of Lithuania, for example, recently did. They just issued an arrest warrant for an enemy combatant. Lithuania was unusual among the countries that were occupied by the Germans in that the Lithuanians themselves carried out the mass murder of Jews before the Germans even had a chance to do it. But now they issued an arrest warrant for an enemy combatant who fits the description. He was a partisan leader who was killing Lithuanian Nazis, which is terrorism, of course. An Israeli. He made it to Israel, became a general. He was the head of the Holocaust Museum, the Yad Vashem Museum, for 20 years. But now they want to arrest him as an enemy combatant because of his terrorist activities against the Lithuanian Nazis during the Second World War. It's pretty hard to fault that. I mean, where's the error? You know, it seems to follow kind of logically, but again, I leave it to you to figure it out. So that's Obama on Iran. Clinton's about the same. I'll keep to Obama because he's the candidate of change, more progressive, and so on. The American public also has opinions in this case. By about 3-1, the American public opposes any threats to Iran and is in favor of negotiations. Roughly the same percentage, around 75% of the public, thinks that Iran should have whatever choices are available to signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it is a signer. Namely, they can have nuclear energy but not nuclear weapons. And again, about 75% of the population agrees with the Iranian proposal. Nobody knows that it's an Iranian proposal. You'd have to do a research project for that again. But they agree with the idea that there should be a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, including Israel, Iran, any American forces deployed there, Pakistan, and so on. So there is agreement on that among the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders in the United States, the Iranians, and technically the U.S. and Britain. The U.S. and Britain are committed to that position formally. The kind of thin excuse that was given for the invasion of Iraq was that Iraq had violated a UN Security Council resolution, 687, which had called on them to dismantle their weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's, that part. But if you bother to read Resolution 687, it has another provision. It says the signers, the U.S. and Britain, are committed to work to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. So the U.S. and British government are committed to this position. It's long been an Iranian position. The American public is strongly in favor of it, but not the responsible men. No candidate could mention such a possibility, or you'll never see an editorial about it or even a report about it. Well, that's the American population. All of this, what it indicates is that if the United States were a functioning democracy, namely the kind that 94% of the population favor, where public opinion plays a role in establishing policy, if it were, then the very dangerous U.S.-Iran confrontation could be mitigated and maybe overcome. And that's crucially important. So important, I think, that it has to be kept silent. Try to find some discussion of any of this. In fact, the public opinion polls weren't reported. Well, let's turn to the last and most difficult and the hardest one to talk about, namely Israel-Palestine. And we should remember here that we're talking about ongoing events, which are a rare event in history. Namely, we're witnessing the death of a nation. It's something that doesn't happen very often. It was called politicide by Baruch Kimmerling, a late Israeli leading sociologist. That's an unusual event. So what does Obama have to say about it? I'll skip Clinton again. You can look it up on his website. Here's what you find. Our first and incontrovertible commitment in the Middle East must be to the security of Israel, which is America's strongest ally in the Middle East. Well, there is a security problem there, namely for the Palestinians. In fact, the question for them is survival, and it's not clear that they will survive. But there's nothing here about our commitment to security for the Palestinians, and for good reasons. They at most could be maybe a weak ally of the United States, not a strong ally. And there's a general operative principle that human rights are essentially determined by your contributions to power, privilege, and ideological needs. And Israel makes major contributions, so therefore they have rights. The Palestinians make no contributions, maybe even a negative contribution by their existence, so they have no rights. And Obama is quite clear about that. Obama also tells you on his website that he favors increase in foreign aid, and also gives the reason. The reason is to ensure that funding priorities to Israel are met, military and economic. So for that reason, we have to increase foreign aid. Furthermore, Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state should never be challenged. As far as I can tell, he's not on record as saying that the existence of any country as a white state or a Christian state or a Muslim state should never be challenged. You can check and see. But in the case of Israel, yes, it has to be, can't be challenged. Furthermore, we cannot recognize Hamas, he says, which is correct. It's logically impossible for the United States to recognize Hamas. It would be like Germany recognizing the Democratic Party. It's a party, can't recognize it. So what that means is we won't recognize the elected government in Palestine, which happens to be led by Hamas. And that makes sense on the basis of our conceptions of democracy. In fact, it's very illustrative of them. Palestinians voted the wrong way in a free election. Okay, therefore, they have to be punished. I mean, that's so obvious that you can't even find a comment about it in the press or anywhere else, because it's obvious. You vote the wrong way in a free election, you have to be punished. Okay? That's democracy. That's just more of those ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. So therefore, we can't recognize that government. It's totally irrelevant that Hamas has repeatedly called for a peaceful two-state settlement of the Israel-Palestine problem in accord with the overwhelming international consensus, which is barred and opposed only by the United States and Israel. And when I say by the United States, I don't mean by the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders in the United States. They favor it too, by a large majority, but not the government. So Washington and Israel oppose it, and therefore it doesn't matter if Hamas supports it along with everyone else. It's unfair to say that Obama ignores the Palestinians entirely. He doesn't. If you look at the website, there is a sentence about them. It says that a better life for Palestinian families is good for both Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, so it's a very balanced statement, as you can see. There's also a kind of a vague mention of a two-state settlement in a form that the most extreme Israeli hawk could accept. Where does this leave? That's Obama. Clinton's about the same or worse. McCain, approximately the same. So those are the choices you have in your every 4 years when you're allowed to push a button and exercise your options. As I say, the population's against all of this. Where does this leave us with regard to the Palestinians? Well, there are essentially two options, no others. One option is that the United States will join the international consensus. And if they do, Israel will go along, has no choices, meaning the United States will agree to accept a two-state settlement on the international border, some qualifications that have been familiar for decades. It's the position that the U.S. has unilaterally blocked for 30 years. Very rare and brief exceptions, and Israel as well. So that's one possibility, namely that the U.S. will go along with the world, including its own population. The other possibility is that the United States and Israel will continue doing what they are in fact doing, which is right before your eyes. You can see it. It's a policy that the Prime Minister of Israel called convergence, to rousing applause and the United States joint session of Congress standing ovation. Convergence means what you see happening. Gaza is turned into a prison where the people can rot. Israel can use it for target practice. As far as the West Bank is concerned, Israel will annex everything inside the so-called separation wall, which should be called an annexation wall. It's no longer in doubt. That includes valuable land and important resources, including the water resources of the region. It also includes Greater Jerusalem, big area surrounding what used to be called Jerusalem. All of this is totally illegal. There's an authoritative opinion of the World Court, unanimous, including the U.S. Justice in a separate declaration, that any settlement in the West Bank is illegal, in violation of international law. No disagreement about this in the world, except for the Israeli High Court and a couple of people here that you can find. So it's all illegal, and in the case of Jerusalem, doubly illegal, because it's in violation of a series of Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. signed, in fact, going back to 1968. But that doesn't matter. Government supports it, so it's okay. And that's only the beginning in the West Bank. You look further, it includes salients, which cut the remainder of the West Bank essentially into three regions, south, central, and north, leaving unviable cantons. Israel's taken over the Jordan Valley. It's about a third of the West Bank, slowly pushing out Palestinian communities, settling it with Jewish settlements. That imprisons whatever separated cantons are left. There's massive infrastructure. Just recently, and this one actually was reported in the Times, I was glad to say, an apartheid road, major apartheid road, and that's what it is. It's a superhighway for Israelis and a kind of a meandering road for Palestinians. The superhighway for Israelis, of course, has access to Jerusalem. In fact, it's for the suburbs. It's for the nice suburbs in the West Bank, the suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So it's a traffic road. It was originally established as on grounds of military security, but that's been long abandoned. The High Court, in its original declaration, said, okay, it's all right if it's for military security. Now that it's for traffic, it's still all right. And there's a Palestinian road alongside it, which doesn't have any access to Jerusalem. It's a kind of a slow way of getting from Bethlehem to Ramallah. You live in Bethlehem, and you can't go to Jerusalem. So it's just another step, one of many, in breaking up the West Bank into unviable cantons. There was a big flap a couple of days ago, and Condoleezza Rice came back from her latest diplomatic mission, and with an agreement, Israel agreed to dismantle 50 roadblocks, 30 of which had been put up since the Annapolis conference last November. The others were sort of piles of sand somewhere. And then there was a quiet announcement a couple of days later that they dismantled one, and that that Israel would be building new settlements in the area right around Jerusalem. Again, doubly illegal, but supported by the master, so it doesn't matter. Well, that's the West Bank, and that has plenty of support here, not just support from the U.S. government, but support from, to quote U.S. public opinion, support from the few big interests looking out for themselves. So if you look at investment in Israel, it's booming. That includes U.S. military industry, which loves Israeli aggressiveness. It's a tremendous source of arms, not only to Israel, but also to much more important to the Arab states. It includes Warren Buffett, Intel, Hewlett-Packard has new investments, Microsoft, also other countries, Swiss, Japanese, India, Tata Industries just investing. So for the people who own and run the world, all of this is fine. They don't see any problem with it, and the U.S. government. This leaves one question about U.S. Israeli policies, what to do about Israel proper. Probably running out of time. All right. There's a problem there, too. Israel has an internal problem. I mean, legal Israel inside the Green Line. The problem is that it's supposed to be a democratic state, but also a Jewish state. And the concept democratic Jewish state, though unchallengeable, Obama tells us, is completely inconsistent with any liberal principles you can imagine. It would work if the Jewishness of the state was symbolic, you know, like what's the day of rest or something like that. Okay, that's more or less pretty much consistent with liberal democratic principles, but it's anything but that. It's very far-reaching in Israel. The most significant part, which was never discussed here, is control of the land. About over 90% of the land is, through a series of laws and administrative arrangements and so on, is effectively in the hands of an organization that is committed by its contract with the State of Israel to work for the benefit of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin. In fact, you help pay for it every April 15th, since you can make tax-free contributions to it. So every American contributes to control of 92% of the land by an organization committed to work for the benefit of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin. That's inside Israel. It also operates in the occupied territories.
You are watching a lecture by Professor Noam Chomsky, giving a lecture which is part of a presentation on U.S. policy in the Middle East. We'll be back to Professor Chomsky after this short program ID. You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any of our previous programs, log on to www.arabic.hour.org.
Reminder to join us for the Evelyn Abdullah Manconi Memorial Culture Series, 4th Memorial Program, Remembrance, Images, and Musical Resonance, in commemoration of the Palestinian Nakba and the Armenian Genocide, to take place on Thursday, April 24th, 2008, from 6:30 to 8:15 p.m. at Boston Public Library, Copley Square. Open to the public free of charge. For more information, visit our website at www.arabichour.org.
And now, back to our program.
So as I say, and this is not a small problem. Actually, it's coming up in the courts in Israel. In the year 2000, the High Court, that's Supreme Court, did hear a case brought by there's an Israeli civil rights group, brought in favor of an Arab couple, Canaan family, who wanted to, very proper middle-class family, educated, all the right conditions, who wanted to move into an all-Jewish city, Katsir, to buy an apartment. The court did issue a ruling in favor of them, a narrow ruling. It took, is that working now? How's that? Still not working? Okay. That will switch up and back. All right. This is better for the video. Okay, can you hear me now? Anyway, okay, so in the case of the Canaan family in Katsir, the court did rule that they had the right to buy an apartment in the city. It took a long time before that was implemented. Apparently, last year they finally were able to buy the apartment, and the family, the Canaan family, announced that they would be selling their house in the Palestinian village where they lived, and they were offering it to Jewish families. They were hoping that a Jewish family would move in, not because they're in favor of integration, but because if a Jewish family moves in, then the town will begin to get roads and services and maybe even light, because the Jewish family will have to go to synagogue on Friday night and so on and so forth. So they're trying to get a Jewish family to move in, which tells you something about how Palestinians live. However, that decision, although it was reached, is barely implemented. Just a couple of weeks ago, a Palestinian family was refused admission to another Jewish town on grounds of incompatibility, that sort of thing. And so this is very, we can't be harsh about this. This is very typical in the United States. I mean, I've been through it all my, 30 years ago in Boston, 40 years ago, I guess, my wife and I couldn't afford the rents in Cambridge anymore and had kids growing up, so we're looking out in the suburbs for a place to live, and we drove around, and I won't mention the town, but there was a town that looked kind of nice, so we asked the real estate agent if there's anything for sale there, and he looked at us and he said, well, you wouldn't be happy there, meaning Jews aren't allowed. Took a century before the 14th Amendment was even formally implemented for blacks, and it's still not actually implemented, far from it. So none of this is unfamiliar to us. But it does illustrate the problems of trying to be a democratic Jewish state. It's not easy. In fact, it's impossible. Well, there are solutions proposed for this. The most extreme solution, the harshest and most extreme solution, is what's proposed on the far left in the United States. Michael Walzer, a very renowned political philosopher, editor of Dissent, democratic socialist, his position is that, quoted, those who are marginal to the nation, meaning the indigenous inhabitants, should be helped to leave. Since he's a liberal humanist, we help them to leave. But get rid of them. If you can get rid of those who are marginal to the nation, namely the original inhabitants, then you won't have a problem of a Jewish democratic state, because everybody will be Jewish. Okay, you leave the Christians, I suppose. They're kind of like the Japanese in South Africa, who were regarded as honorary whites. But so that's the most extreme position. If you go to the very far right in Israel, you get a more moderate version of this position. Avigdor Lieberman, who's regarded in Israel as practically a neo-Nazi, did propose something like this, but tamer. He said that he proposed that the areas of heavy Arab population concentration in Israel should be forcibly transferred into some kind of derisory Palestinian state made up of the little cantons that will be left to them. Of course, you don't ask the people, if they want to go from a rich first world country to a poor third world country, which barely exists. You just do it. And that would also solve the demographic problem, as it's called. That was considered, when he proposed it, unacceptable racist position, but it's moved toward the center. It's recently been accepted by the leading figures in Kadima, the governing party, including Tzipi Livni, who's foreign minister, is sort of the hope of the doves. And I suspect that that will be presented sooner or later, and it'll be presented as a land swap, a forthcoming land swap in which each side gives up something. We give up the people who are marginal to the nation, and you give up the valuable lands. We're all equal. And I think that would be accepted here when it's presented, at least by the people who matter, the elites. I don't know about the population. Well, that's those are the options right now. Either it will be a two-state settlement, or it'll be this. What's in fact going on before our eyes, and will increase within Israel itself. Now, there is an illusion, which is pretty common these days among supporters of the Palestinians, that there's another option. The other option would be what's sometimes called a one-state solution, meaning let's just give up the idea of two states. Israel within, from the Jordan to the sea, will be a single state. It'll be an apartheid state, of course. It'll have, half the population won't have rights. And then you can have a civil rights struggle, and it'll be like South Africa, and you can overcome apartheid. That is a total illusion. I mean, there is not the remotest possibility that the United States or Israel or, in fact, anyone else would allow that to happen. Israel will if that position is pushed, Israel and the United States will simply proceed with the policies they are now implementing. They're not going to take responsibility for the Palestinian population that's left scattered up in the hills somewhere or in the Gaza prison. Say, okay, fine, you guys take care of yourselves. We'll take what we want, as we're now doing, and you're free to become anything you want. Jordanians, stateless, Martians, whatever you decide to call yourself. But we'll take no responsibility. And in fact, that will simply be fulfilling a position that was proposed by 30 years ago by Moshe Dayan, who was in charge of the occupied territories, and among the Israeli leaders, probably the one most sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. He informed his cabinet colleagues, Labor Party, the Doves, that we should tell the Palestinians that we have no solution for them. They will live like dogs, and whoever wants to leave can leave. And we'll see where that goes. And that's, in fact, the policy that's being implemented step by step. And it is the policy that will be followed if the two-state settlement is not realized, maybe as a first stage towards something else, but at least it's the only feasible thing. Well, these, as far as I can see, are is what's likely for the range of U.S. policies, no matter who's in office. And the only way to alter this that I can see is for us to take seriously the rhetoric about democracy promotion that's proclaimed, with great enthusiasm, and turn it from empty rhetoric, which it is, to reality, and applying it where it has to be applied, most crucially, right here.
That was Professor Noam Chomsky's presentation, which was part of a conference sponsored by the ADC-MA, which focused on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Please join us next week, where we will air the second part of the conference, which was a special mini-debate between Professor Chomsky and Omar Baddar, the executive director of ADC-MA, on perspectives of the Israel lobby. We'll be back after this short program ID. Hello, I am your host, Ghanwa Hakim, and you are watching the Arabic Hour. On April 3rd, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee presented a conference with Professor Noam Chomsky and Omar Baddar. The lecture focused on presidential elections, troop surges in Iraq, and current U.S. policy towards the Middle East. Last week, we brought you the first part of the conference with Professor Noam Chomsky speaking on the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. On today's program, we will be bringing you the second part, a mini-debate between Professor Chomsky and Omar Baddar, the executive director of the ADC-MA. Their mini-debate was Perspectives on the Israel Lobby. Without further delay, let us now go to Boston University with Professor Noam Chomsky and Omar Baddar.
Let me first start by saying that it was exposure to Professor Chomsky's analysis roughly 9 years ago at age 17 that sort of got me to begin to think critically about world affairs. So I have tremendous respect and admiration for him, and I'm actually honored to be sharing a panel with him. I got a message recently from a student at Brandeis University, somebody who clearly knows nothing about either my views or Professor Chomsky's views about the Israel lobby. And basically, he was outraged at the thought that I would be debating Professor Chomsky, saying a debate is supposed to be between people who disagree with each other, and here you have Professor Chomsky debating some guy from an Arab organization. Yeah, right, some debate. Which I guess is a really good point, given the fact that there is a monolithic view that all Arabs subscribe to at birth or something, which apparently Professor Chomsky happened to get in the wrong line at that subscription process or something.
But in reality, within people who actually understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and who share a critique of U.S. policy towards it, there is a debate over what actually drives that policy. On one end of the spectrum, you have people like Professors Mearsheimer and Walt, who argue that the Israel lobby essentially overrides independent U.S. policy preferences to the detriment of U.S. interests, and they go as far as to say that the invasion of Iraq was in large part due to the Israel lobby's influence. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people like Stephen Zunes and Professor Chomsky and others who basically say that the Israel lobby really hardly has any independent influence.
And that it only appears to be powerful because its agenda happens to mesh pretty well with that of the centers of power in the U.S. And furthermore, those policies are not basically harming U.S. interests as defined by those centers of power. Now, I think that neither perspective is entirely accurate in that while Mearsheimer and Walt definitely exaggerate the extent of the Israel lobby's influence on foreign policy, I still do think that a strong argument could be made that the Israel lobby has driven policy in a way that was harmful to U.S. Interests. Now, when I talk about the Israel lobby, I basically accept a variation of the definition of Mearsheimer and Walt of it. Not the original one that came out in their paper. That was a bit too broad and vague, and for that matter, bordered tautology in that it basically said anybody who's ever lobbied for the interests of Israel is part of the lobby. But they take a more sophisticated definition of that in their book, which is the one that I sort of think is somewhat accurate. So when I say the lobby, I'm talking about national organizations whose primary and explicit purpose is the promotion of Israel's interests in the United States. So we're talking about groups like AIPAC, the Zionist Organization of America, the Israel Project, Christians United for Israel, as well as media watchdog groups whose basically primary purpose is to tilt media coverage in Israel's favor, groups like Camera and Honest Reporting and others. And then on top of that, there are allied groups to the lobby. Those are groups or organizations whose, even though the interests of Israel are not their primary focus, they nevertheless happen to basically mesh with those of the main organizations. And here I'm talking about the broader right-wing Christian evangelical movement, think tanks who basically their views of analysis on world affairs are tinted through Israeli eyes, like the Washington Institute of Near East Policy and other organizations that basically happen to share the views and the interests of major pro-Israel organizations. And in mainstream political science literature, basically the determinants of success for interest groups have been fairly outlined. They include things like membership size, financial resources, unity, institutional complexity, access to power, coalition building, and so on. And I don't really have time to get into how the Israel lobby measures up on each one of these, but suffice it to say that it measures up very well. In fact, the Israel lobby is extremely powerful in a way that basically every mainstream political scientist does acknowledge. If you want those details, basically you can read, for example, the Mearsheimer-Walt book. Then you look at U.S. policy towards Israel. You see that Israel is the single largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, receiving roughly $3 billion a year, 3/4 of which is military aid, and it's about, here we go. Is yours still working?
This one working? Yeah.
All right. You see that Israel is the single largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, receiving roughly $3 billion each year, 2/3 of which is military aid, and that's about to be converted into entirely, in its entirety, to military aid as well. You also see that Israel is the only country that receives that aid all in one allocation at the beginning of each fiscal year, is not basically required to account for it. Israel receives privileged intelligence from the United States and is allowed to develop nuclear weapons when many other countries obviously are under the threat of force over the thought. And then you look at U.S. policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To reiterate something that Professor Chomsky just said, essentially there has been a practical solution on the table, not a perfect one, but a practical one, for over 20 years now, which calls for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state. The Palestinians accepted this, so did the Arab League and virtually the entire international community through the United Nations. And Israel is single-handedly essentially blocking the solution. And the U.S. is backing them up. I mean, even not just with continued military and financial support, but also diplomatically. The U.S. has vetoed over 40 UN resolutions that are critical of Israel's violations of international law and human rights, which is, to put that in perspective, is greater than the number of vetoes used by all other permanent members of the UN Security Council combined on all matters. So it is kind of an obscene figure. So you look at the Israel lobby and you say it's powerful, and then you look at US policy towards Israel and you see unrestrained support. And people might feel tempted to come to the conclusion that the Israel lobby is responsible for this policy. But it's not quite that simple, because there are other forces that could account for that policy as well. For example, Israel has been of extreme strategic utility to the US. They defeated Nasser's nationalism in 1967, which the US really needed. They protected King Hussein's regime during the events of Black September from Syrian intervention. They supplied weapons to apartheid South Africa and the Contras in Latin America at a time when it would look bad for the US to do that directly, and in fact illegal. And basically, Israel is the dominant military force in the Middle East, and it's a stable one. So that makes it extremely important for the United States strategically. So even the US grand strategy could also account for US support for Israel. Furthermore, US military aid that goes to Israel, basically, huge parts of it, something close to 70%, comes back to US military corporations. So in essence, US military aid to Israel is a form of subsidy to US military corporations. So you can see that the defense establishment would also be in favor of this strong relationship. So given the fact that the defense establishment, the US grand strategy, and the Israel lobby all advocate a policy, when you have multiple players, it becomes a bit difficult to isolate and assess the influence of one particular player, and in this case, that's the Israel lobby. And the way to resolve this is to look at cases where the Israel lobby alone contradicted, basically was in conflict with the other forces that support this current policy. Now, unfortunately, the record does not resolve this problem because the record shows mixed results. So, for example, Professor Chomsky and others have pointed to the 2005 incident when Israel sold sophisticated military technology to China against U.S. wishes. The U.S. essentially humiliated Israel, and the lobby didn't say a word. They forced Israel to apologize publicly, which they did. In 1993, there was the incident where Israel was working out a deal with North Korea by which North Korea would cease to provide long-range missiles to Iran in return for Israeli investments in North Korea, which, you know, when you're talking about missiles to Iran, this is something of serious strategic national security interest for Israel. And the U.S., in an effort to isolate North Korea, was basically able to compel Israel to end the deal. And in both those cases, the lobby, didn't say a word. And even in cases where the lobby did get active protesting, for example, there was the case of 1981 when the United States wanted to sell, the Reagan administration wanted to sell advanced radar systems to Saudi Arabia. The Israel lobby essentially threw a fit, and they got very active, and they gave the administration a very difficult time, and they almost canceled the deal. Only here, the defense industry, namely Boeing and United Technologies, basically, who had hundreds of millions of dollars on the deal, basically got together and said that they were not going to allow this to happen. And sure enough, in cooperation with the Saudis and with the administration that was bent on getting this through, they were able to crush the lobby's opposition, and the deal actually went through. So all of these cases demonstrate the limits of the Israel lobby's influence. But on the other hand, Mearsheimer and Walt can point to cases where the Israel lobby did overcome administration opposition. So, for example, in 2002, Ariel Sharon launched Operation Defensive Shield in the West Bank, killing hundreds of Palestinians at a time when Bush basically was trying to gather up support for the Iraq War. So he did not want to be on bad terms with the Arab world. And so he demanded that basically Israel end its incursion. A couple of days later, he clarified that he meant that Israel should end it immediately. And a day after that, Condoleezza Rice got on TV quite upset, saying, immediately means now. We expect the Israelis to end the incursion now. And in response, the Israel lobby essentially swung into action. There were 100,000 emails that were sent to the White House from Christian evangelical coalitions. Basically, AIPAC applied pressure on Congress, and the next thing you know, Congress is passing resolutions basically supporting Israel's incursion in defiance of the administration's requests to the opposite. And eventually, Bush essentially caved. He realized this was not worth the fight, and he said that Israel had responded satisfactorily to his call, but Israel had actually done no such thing. So this is one example of the lobby overcoming U.S. administration opposition. Another would be the settlement building that goes on. Virtually every president up until the second George W. Bush opposed settlements quite explicitly. And in the case of George Bush I, the opposition was so intense that he actually threatened to cut off loan guarantees to Israel. And there are heated comments on the record from James Baker and Bush I that basically showed that they were quite upset about this. But in the end, the settlements continued, and the settlements continue until today. So I think the pattern that you see emerging is that when we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israel lobby seems to be able to get its way over administration opposition. But when you're talking about broader strategic issues, the lobby does not stand a chance in the face of more powerful players. And what's important to note here is one might say, well, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not of strategic interest, so the U.S. doesn't care that much. But the problem here is that this is not entirely true, is that U.S. policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been very costly for the United States on many fronts, the obvious ones being national security and the United States' image in the world. And then, of course, in terms of strategic positioning in the Middle East, and for that matter, in more details about access to oil and things like that. So on this particular issue, you can say that the Israel lobby does override independent U.S. policy preferences on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the detriment of the United States. And I know we're running out of time, so we can talk more about that in a bit.
Well, there isn't going to be much of a debate because I basically agree with almost everything you've said, and I've written it many times. I think you're right in taking the narrow definition of the Israeli lobby. Even in the book, Walt Mearsheimer sometimes defined the lobby so loosely that it becomes close to tautologous. But if we keep to organized groups, like, for example, the Christian evangelicals, who, as you say, were instrumental, who you claim, I don't agree, were instrumental in overcoming administration opposition to the Operation Defensive Shield, destruction of Jenin. Yeah, that's a big group. Christian evangelicals are probably a third of the Republican vote, maybe a quarter of the population, huge electoral bloc. But the government does not go along with them. Their position is that the U.S. should support every Israeli action, everything, blow up the Temple Mount, which they've tried to do. And the U.S. government doesn't do that. Their reason for doing it is because they're dedicated anti-Semites. Their position, probably the most extreme. They want, a lot of them are accept a particular interpretation, the rapture interpretation of Revelations, which says what's going to happen is there's going to be a war, Gog and Magog and all that business, and then there'll be a great war in Armageddon. Everybody will be slaughtered, and those who are saved, namely us, will rise to heaven. What happens to the Jews? Well, they're not saved. Okay, so that's anti-Semitism at its most extreme level. And yes, they do want to support Israeli policies because they'll lead the war. But the U.S. government doesn't go along with that. In the case of Operation Defensive Shield, notice that if that's used as an example, then the lobby argument is in a serious self-contradiction. Walt and Mearsheimer, as you point out, try to claim that Israel drove the United States to the Iraq War on the side. That's completely contradicted even by their own evidence. But suppose we accept it as true. The logic that you outlined is that the lobby the lobby harmed U.S. interests by forcing the U.S. to accept the Jenin operations, even though it was undermining support for going to war with Iraq. Well, you can't have both positions. Either the lobby drove us to the war with Iraq, or the lobby harmed the effort to go to the war with Iraq, but not both. So I don't think that example shows much, and in fact, I don't know of any evidence that the U.S. cared one way or another whether Israel smashed up Jenin. Yeah, it caused a lot of problems in to adopt the standard racist terminology, what's called the Arab Street. We don't talk about the British street or the French street, but there's a thing called the Arab Street, namely the population. And yeah, the population didn't like it. In fact, Bush is much more unpopular in, say, Saudi Arabia than Ahmadinejad or Jenin or Osama bin Laden. But the question is whether anybody cares about that. I mean, as long as the U.S.-backed tyrannies are able to completely control their own populations, then the U.S. government doesn't care that much about the populations. And they have been able to do that. The most valued and oldest ally of the United States in the region is actually Saudi Arabia. It's where most of the oil is. It's also the most extreme fundamentalist tyranny in the world. And if you look at what harms U.S. policy, we know, not just now, but way back. Back in the 1950s, in 1958, President Eisenhower asked his staff why there's a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world. And the National Security Council, highest planning agency, had just given an answer. They said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh, brutal, tyrannical regimes and impedes development and democracy, and does so because it wants to control our oil. They went on to say the perception's true, and that's the way we should do it. So yeah, that harms U.S. interests if you think that the so-called Arab Street is something that the U.S. cares about. And so that persists until today. Right after 9/11, the Wall Street Journal did a study of the kind of Arabs they care about, what they called moneyed Muslims, rich guys, you know, directors of multinational corporations, bank managers, that sort of thing, people very much embedded inside the U.S.-dominated system, and asked them, you know, why they were antagonistic to the U.S. They gave basically the same reasons. They did add the sanctions against Iraq as a major reason, and also repression of the Palestinians, but they focused on the same reasons. The U.S. supports harsh and undemocratic regimes, tyrannies, blocks democracy and development, and does so because it wants to control our oil. Okay, it's not the U.S., the Israeli lobby that's pushing that. That's the way the U.S. has determined its strategic goals, not only in the Middle East, the same everywhere else. You know, same policies around the world. Nothing special about the Middle East. There are, as far as the, just one factual comment, as far as the scale of the lobby, you know, in the sense that you correctly define it, in political science terms, you know, money, membership, that sort of thing, that's been analyzed in detail by Stephen Zunis, and I advise you to look at it. And it turns out it's one of the smaller lobbies. It's dwarfed. I mean, it's totally dwarfed by the business lobbies, which are totally overwhelming, and even by things like the lawyers' lobby or, you know, the real estate agents' lobby and so on. I mean, it's influential, but it's influential, I think, largely because, as you say, it conforms mostly to U.S. policy. I don't consider the cases that you mentioned very, let's take the George Bush 1 case, which is an interesting one, which is seriously misunderstood. That's the other example that's standardly given for the power of the lobby. George Bush #1 and his Secretary of State, James Baker, took the most extreme position against the Palestinians and support of Israeli expansion of any president. But they did it in secret, so they weren't getting any lobby support or pressure for it. I mean, we now know, because actually the documents were known, but they were kept quiet. They took the position. They supported the coalition, the Israeli coalition government position, the Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Shamir position, that there can be, I'm quoting it now, no additional Palestinian state between the Jordan and the sea, meaning there already is a Palestinian state, namely Jordan, and there can't be an additional Palestinian state. And the fate of the territories, they said, has to be implemented in accord with the wishes of the government of Israel. That was endorsed in what was called the Baker Plan, the December 1989 Baker Plan, which endorsed exactly that position. That's the harshest position, anti-Palestinian position, that's been taken by any American president. That was George Bush, the first. No lobby pressure. The lobby probably didn't know about it. But yeah, that's the position they took. It's kind of like saying that the Jews don't need Israel because they already have New York, so there has to be an additional Jewish state It's very much like that. If anybody were to say that, he'd be called a Nazi, you know. But that's the position that George Bush the First and James Baker took. No pressure from the lobby. The conflict was over something else. Yitzhak Shamir happened to be unusually abrasive. He would wait until James Baker showed up in Jerusalem, and right at that moment, brazenly announced, we're setting up a settlement on such and such a hilltop. Okay, you don't treat the Godfather that way. You have to be more polite. You have to do it the way Shimon Peres does. You say, thank you, master, we will not settle any more settlements, just like you say, and a week after you leave, we'll put up the outpost and build it, and then everybody's happy. Exactly what happened with Condoleezza Rice on her last trip. That's the way you're supposed to behave. If you behave too abrasively to the master, he's not going to like it. So therefore, they made a weak threat to withhold funds, which of course they didn't live up to. But I don't really think this had anything to do with the lobby. However, this entire discussion illustrates 2 points. One, why, for me personally, it illustrates why I don't even get into this discussion. I haven't even written about it. I think one paragraph somewhere. Because there's something mildly or maybe seriously distasteful about the whole discussion, in my opinion. As I said, a nation is dying in front of our eyes, okay? And we are focusing on an abstract discussion, which may be appropriate for some seminar somewhere, about the various factors that influence policy, which overwhelmingly coincide, but sometimes differ. And we're asking, well, you know, which one is more influential in the few cases that they differ? Actually, I basically agree with you. Where for this abstract discussion, where major U.S. interests, in the sense of interests of those who matter, where they're involved, the Israeli lobby has no effect. On issues that don't matter much to the United States, yeah, the lobby can have an effect, just like the Armenian lobby can have an effect. I mean, the Armenian lobby came very close to, just a couple months ago, to seriously harming U.S. relations with one of its most important allies, Turkey, over the Armenian genocide. But they came pretty close. And that's what lobbies can do. But where any serious interest is concerned, they're just told to get lost. That was true on the China case. 2005 was particularly striking, again in 2000. The North Korean case was a very important case. North Korea had agreed to stop sending any missile technology or any other advanced military technology to the Middle East, the entire Middle East, in return for Israeli recognition. And the Clinton administration simply told them no. And for Israel, that is of very serious significance. There was a big fuss a couple of months ago about Israel allegedly bombing some site in northern Syria, which is supposed to, they claimed had North Korean support. Well, whatever tiny element of truth there might be to that, there would be nothing at all like that, or even any threat, if Israel hadn't bowed to U.S. pressure. And we get a real issue. I think you find that's what happens. As far as the Arab Street is concerned, the U.S. doesn't care any more than Saudi Arabia does. However, there's another point that should be made. Let's take this abstract discussion, which personally I find distasteful, about which factor in policy, which of the many factors in policy that almost always coincide has more weight. And let's ask, does it have any practical consequences, how the discussion turns out? Okay, so suppose we decide with Walt and Mearsheimer that in cases, that there are cases of serious concern to, powerful American interests where the U.S. backs off because of the lobby. Well, if that's true, there is a consequence, a tactical consequence. One consequence, for me, it would be terrific. I could stop writing books, I could stop writing articles, stop giving talks all over the place, stop getting vilified, nothing. All I'd have to do, or you'd have to do, or anyone else concerned with the problem would have to do, is put on our ties and jackets, go to the headquarters of corporate headquarters of Lockheed Martin, Intel, Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft, Warren Buffett, ExxonMobil, and so on, and politely explain to them that their interests are being harmed by a lobby that they can put out of business in 30 seconds with their political clout and economic force. Okay? Game's over. We've won. Does anybody do it? I mean, does anybody even bother to laugh? Well, no. Yeah. I mean, it's laughable. If the few big interests looking out for themselves didn't like what was happening, they'd do something about it. And what they're doing about it is investing in Israel. You know, not under pressure of the Christian evangelicals or AIPAC, but because they find it useful to have a powerful state, most powerful state in the region, actually with military forces that are more, with air and armored forces that are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power, let alone the region outside the U.S., and that is totally subordinate to the United States. Israel made a decision a long time ago that it would sacrifice security for expansion, which makes it totally subordinate to the United States, has to do what the U.S. wants, very loyal, performs any task that's wanted, right on the periphery of the major oil-producing regions. The tyrannies who run the oil producers really don't mind as long as they can control their own populations. So it's it's a system that works for the interests of the few big interests who look out for themselves. And we see it in their behavior. If we think they're being misled, well, we should explain it to them so that they'll change their behavior and put the lobby out of business. But as far as I can see, that's the only practical consequence to this discussion. Otherwise, it's an abstract discussion, which you can have off in some seminar room, about the relative weight of two factors in policy formation that almost always coincide but sometimes conflict. And while that's maybe an intellectually interesting discussion, I can't get much involved in it when we see a nation being killed under our eyes.
Just a couple of things to point out. If I thought that this discussion was entirely of no consequence to basically activism to end the occupation and so on, I would consider it distasteful as well. The only thing is that I think if you operate under the assumption that the reason why the U.S. supports the monstrous policies that Israel carries out in the occupied territories is because of the influence of a lobby, then the natural course, what that leads people of conscience to do is to say, okay, well, all we have to do is present a counter voice and sort of like try to drown the other voice, create a counter force, and that would influence policy in the correct direction. But if you take the view that the Israel lobby has no influence and that the U.S. is not really susceptible to lobby pressure, then that might give people the impression of this thing is entirely hopeless. If the Israel lobby does not influence policy, we certainly would not be able to, and therefore advocating for basically Palestinian human rights would be an endeavor that is not worth taking. So I think for me, I'm invested in saying that there is a lobby, and if you counter it, you can be effective as a way of getting people to basically get more involved in the issue. Now, the argument here is that the reason why the Israel lobby gets away with what it does with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is because this is an issue that does not matter for U.S. policymakers. And my argument here is precisely the opposite, is that it does. Take a couple of examples. So, in the U.S. grand strategy in the region, they're genuinely afraid of Iranian influence. Now, the fact that the U.S. has allowed the conflict to perpetuate, and that fact that Iran is able to basically take advantage of that by spreading its influence throughout the region, by taking advantage of popular hostility towards Israeli policies. I mean, this is something of serious threat to the U.S. If there was no conflict, Iran would have nothing to play on to spread its influence. And so, strategically speaking, it seems of crucial importance for the United States to take active steps to end the conflict. On the question of oil, for example, you look at Saudi Arabia. There's a reason why they're pushing for the Arab Initiative, basically to resolve the conflict as well. They presented it again in 2007. Basically, they're desperate to end the conflict because The conflict is a major source of popular discontent throughout the region. And if Saudi Arabia is going to continue to basically toe the United States line, this is going to cause problems for it in terms of governmental stability. So again, here you have a case where it seems that oil companies certainly have an interest in the stability of the Saudi government, and the Saudi government thinks that this is an important issue to resolve for stability. So it seemed that it would follow that oil companies would be in favor of basically putting pressure to end the conflict. So now, like, the way I look at it is, going to the oil lobbies and actually talking to them and explaining these things does not become so outrageous an idea. And if you want to take it a step further, so take, for example, especially with the potential election of McCain, if the U.S. actually invades Iran, or bombs it for that matter, it's going to need the logistical support of Persian Gulf countries. Now, given the current climate in the Middle East, those governments are going to have a very difficult time basically giving that logistical support for the U.S. Their survival is seriously at risk. Now, if the U.S. gives something in return for these regimes to pacify their populations, looking at it hawkishly from a strategic perspective from the U.S., the best thing to do would be to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to basically make things easier for the broader, grand strategic plan for the United States in the region. So basically what I'm arguing here is that the perpetuation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is of basically is a strategic harm for U.S. interests in a very serious way that U.S. Policymakers should take seriously. And the last thing on the size of the lobby. Basically, you have polls that are taken of Congress and their staffers who basically consistently show that they view the Israel lobby as one of the most influential lobbies in Congress. Bill Clinton referred to them as, basically said AIPAC was, that AIPAC lobby is better than anybody else does in Washington. So you have this recognition on behalf of Congress that the Israel lobby is influential. And so if it is correct, as I and most Americans think it is, that U.S. policy, generally speaking, is over-influenced by lobbies, and then you add to that the fact that Congress acknowledges that the Israel lobby is of tremendous influence, it follows that the Israel lobby does have significant influence on policy. And the last thing I want to point out is the Israel lobby boasts of its ability to defeat people running for political office, basically, who do not toe the line. I mean, there are countless statements by AIPAC members and many others who basically say, we've cost so-and-so the election, and, we hope that people will get the message now. And you can actually see that in effect when you look at presidential candidates falling over each other, trying to portray themselves as extremely supportive of Israel for the obvious reasons. And I'm thinking, if a lobby has that much control over the political survival of people running for office and in Congress, then they de facto, if not ipso facto, have an influence over policy, because nobody can, basically take on a policy that the lobby would consider unacceptable.
Well, again, I have only a small factual disagreement and agree with the main thrust. The factual disagreement has to do with the power of the lobby. And here I won't go through the details, but I just suggest that you look at Stephen Zunis's careful, detailed analysis of it, which shows that there's almost no effect on candidates running for office. The most passionate supporters of Israel are mostly in safe districts, like Nancy Pelosi. Nobody's going to run against them. And the lobby has basically no effect. Of course, they claim to have an effect. The Armenian lobby will also claim to have an effect, and you can find 2 or 3 scattered cases, but basically on Congress, the effect is very marginal. Now, it's true, as you say, that Congress thinks of the lobby as very powerful, but that's the reason for that is that the real lobbies, they just take for granted. Like, they're not going to tell you that the business lobby is powerful, or the telecommunications lobby, or the farm lobby. I mean, sure, that's what we're here for. We work for them. They're not powerful. That's who we are. Clinton's not going to say the telecommunications lobby won the 1990. I shifted policy in 1996 to win the election because of funding from them. He did, but you don't talk about that because that's the way the system works. There's nothing to discuss. That's like saying I'm breathing air or something. So sure, they don't refer to the real lobbies, but As far as the rest is concerned, you were actually giving an argument in favor of what I said, I think. I don't happen to agree with you on the analysis of the situation entirely, but suppose we accept your analysis completely. The U.S. policy with regard to Israel-Palestine is harming the interests of the few big interests who run the country, okay? Like the ones I mentioned, Lockheed Martin, ExxonMobil, Intel, Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, all the ones who seem to be very happy with the present situation. So U.S. policy is actually harming their interests. Well, there is a tactical consequence. Namely, we're wasting our time here. We should be going to their offices and explaining to them that this marginal lobby, which they can put out of business in 30 seconds, is harming their interests, as if they can't figure it out for themselves. But since they somehow can't figure it out for themselves, we'll explain it to them. And then it's over. As far as the induced passivity, try to find an argument against that tactical consequence. I've been brought up to Walt Mearsheimer many times. No answer, because there is no answer. If it was harming their interests, they would do something about it. What they are doing about it is supporting just what I described, the increasing investments in Israel. I think it's fine. Maybe there's some minor nuisances here and there, but they do it. As far as making people passive, I think the opposite is true. If you convince people that the lobby is all powerful, then there's nothing much to do about it. We can't stop the lobby from functioning. If you think it's the U.S. government which is following certain policies that we don't like, there's a lot that we can do about it. We could turn this into a functioning democracy in which popular opinion matters. And it's not just on this issue, but on a whole range of other issues. And that's what we should be doing.
You are watching a mini debate on the Israel lobby between Professor Noam Chomsky and Omar Baddar, part of a conference sponsored by ADC-MA on U.S. policy in the Middle East. We'll be back with more of the debate after this short program ID. You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To watch today's program or any of our previous programs, log on to www.arabic.hour.org. And now, back to our program.
I'm just going to ask that people who have questions raise their hand, and when I call on, please stand and speak as loudly as you can. I know sometimes we have to set up our questions with a couple of facts. If you have to do that, try to limit it to 30 seconds, 45 seconds. And I'm going to try to call around the room. Why don't we go here, and then here, and then here.
It seems to me that the most powerful part of the lobby is the fact that they can attack people in academia, people who write about Palestinian rights and about what Israel is doing, people who try to organize to do something about it. That's where the lobby is really powerful and very effective, and trying to keep people from getting tenured, all the kinds of things that they've been doing. So that's where we in our organizations, we struggle with them all the time. The United States government's not struggling with them, we are. So that's one point I want to make. The other is that Noam keeps mentioning Stephen Zunis, and I just want to announce that he's going to be speaking at Tufts on April 25th and 26th. Oh. There's a conference organized by New England United, and I urge you all to come, and you can look up New England United on the website. There'll be more information about it there.
On the first point, just a brief comment. As you mentioned, Walt and Mearsheimer give several definitions of the lobby. One of them is the narrow one, which I agree you focused on. There's another one that they give, which is that the lobby is just those people who dedicate themselves to supporting Israel's interests no matter what. Well, the problem with that definition, it includes practically the whole intellectual community after 1967, not before. But after 1967, when Israel performed a real service to the United States, the intellectuals just had a love affair with Israel. So I mentioned dissent before. The Democratic Socialist Journal, if you check it before 1967, Israel's barely mentioned, or maybe mentioned with contempt. Afterwards, you get Michael Walzer and Irving Howe and passionate Zionists. They take a journal, take, say, Norman Podhoretz. You know, you can't get a more extreme advocate. Take a look at his book, Making It, which was published in early 1967. Norman Finkelstein, who's a very assiduous researcher, went through all this, and he made some interesting discoveries. He doesn't even mention Israel, doesn't care. 1967, it turns out there's a big turn. And when you talk about pressure on universities, no university has to submit to AIPAC pressure. They do it if the majority of the faculty agree that that's what they want to do. Otherwise, they can tell them to get lost. So we're now talking about the lobby in the large sense of the word, which includes the media. The lobby doesn't influence New York Times editorials. We're just talking about the educated world at large, which almost reflexively supports U.S. government policy, except in narrow ways. Can't give a principled objection, and supports Israel insofar as it's perceived to be, associated with fundamental U.S. interests. So that's a real struggle. I agree with you, a major one. But I don't, and it's true that the lobby is in the forefront because they're the ones who launched the vilification and the slanders and so on and so forth. But they can be blocked if it weren't that they were supported by the general community. So it's a battle, and a serious one.
Nancy?
Just a quick question. Now, would you say something about Lebanon? People in southern Lebanon are convinced they're going to be invasion, and we do have those American ships hovering there. And I wonder if you have any insights.
Well, I don't know anything other than what I read. There are reports in the Israeli press now that Syrian army is mobilizing in preparation for a possible Israeli attack, and the scenario that they talk about is a Hezbollah action in retaliation for the Mughniya assassination in Damascus, which they and many others blame on Israel. And it's clear that Israel's been sort of itching for a chance to invade again and do what they failed to do last time, harm Hezbollah. They probably helped them. So it's not impossible, but my own guess is if it takes place, it would be only as part of a broader action against Iran. I mean, the only real concern of Israel and the U.S. about Hezbollah, which has been pretty quiet, in fact, from the Israeli withdrawal in 2000 until 2006, there wasn't a single rocket firing attributed to Hezbollah up till July 2006. What they're concerned about is it is a deterrent to U.S. attack on Iran. So if the U.S. decides to attack Iran, or Israel decides to attack Iran, Hezbollah rockets, which may be more advanced now, are a deterrent. They can rain on Israel. That's a deterrent, and they want to eliminate it. So my guess is if there's an attack, that's what it'll be. Incidentally, the same is true of this whole discussion of missile defense in Eastern Europe, which is causing serious rifts with the Russians. I mean, for the Russians, it's a serious problem because these systems, if they ever work, are a threat to the Russian deterrent. And in fact, they're placed in a position which makes them a threat to the Russian deterrent. You can read that. U.S. strategic analysts explain it. But the official pretext is their defense of Europe. They're defending Europe against an Iranian attack. I mean, that's at a level of Ronald Reagan putting on his cowboy boots and quaking in terror because the Nicaraguan army was 2 days from Harlingen, Texas. You remember that incident. People didn't laugh because we're disciplined around here. But Europe is about as likely to be hit by an Iranian missile as it is by an asteroid. So if Europe's interested in defense, it might be putting up an asteroid defense system. Unless the Iranians are dedicated to being vaporized in 1 second, they would never send off a missile with a nuclear weapon, even if they had one, because of the obvious reaction. So what the missile defense system is for, the only function it can serve, apart from being a threat to the Russian deterrent, hence a U.S. first strike weapon, is as a threat to Iran. It's telling Iran, no matter, even if you get missiles and nuclear weapons, you're not going to be able to use them. We can hit you first and you can't react. Missile defense altogether is a first strike weapon. It's pretty well understood on all sides. It's saying we can deter a retaliatory strike, so we can strike you first with impunity. And that's the way it's understood on all sides. I think Hezbollah is regarded pretty much the same way. Lebanon is in terrible shape now. I mean, it's a real pity because it's a wonderful country. It has every reason to live in peace, but it's being torn apart to a large extent by outside pressures.
A question for Professor Chomsky. How, if at all, you think your views on Israel and the Middle East have been affected by your growing up as a Jew in a Jewish family?
Yeah, well, I grew up as in an intensely Jewish environment, in fact, Jewish ghetto pretty much, and was a Zionist youth leader and so on. And it may surprise you, but my views as a Zionist youth leader in the 1940s are about the same as what they are now. I was part of what was the Zionist movement that was opposed to a Jewish state. And that was a substantial part of the Zionist movement in those days. There wasn't an official commitment to the Jewish state until 1942. It was maybe in people's minds, but it's not official in the United States, incidentally. And it remained a substantial part of what was called the Zionist movement in Palestine, too, that was against the Jewish state for the kinds of reasons I mentioned, and in favor of Arab-Jewish cooperation. They were socialists, so Arab-Jewish working-class cooperation. That was the part of the Zionist movement I was connected with, and circumstances change, so the tactics you think of change. But and I wrote about it. From 1967 to 1975, there was a real chance, in my view, to institute what's now called a one-state solution. Israel could have moved to create a federal arrangement inside Cisjordan, Jordan to the Sea, which they controlled, with a Palestinian and a primarily Palestinian, primarily Jewish entity to be federated, could lead to further integration as circumstances allow. And that would end up with some kind of democratic state. That option, if you're interested, I wrote about it at the time. There's a book, a lot of articles. And it was just total anathema on every side. Everybody hated it. By 1975 it was over. By the time the Palestinians had committed themselves to an independent state, and the world had accepted what has become the total international consensus on a two-state settlement, this proposal was gone. An interesting question you might ask is why it's popular now when it's completely unfeasible, whereas it was anathema when it was feasible. So why is it that the New York Times and the New York Review of Books and so on publish articles on it now when they would have been willing to slaughter you when you suggested it when it was feasible? I think you can make up an answer to that, which is not too pleasant, but I'll leave it to you. But yeah, it certainly influenced. It's one of the main reasons I'm interested in this. One of the main reasons why I studied Arabic for years in college. Yeah, this was major interest.
Roger Leisner, Radio Free Maine. In 1994, I taped you and Israel Shahak, a noted Israeli dissident, speaking on religious fundamentalism in Israeli domestic and foreign policies. So 14 years later, has religious fundamentalism disappeared from Israel? Is it getting stronger? What's the status?
Well, minor correction. That was Israel Shahak giving a talk, and I introduced him. Okay. Yeah, old friend. But and if you remember, the meeting was practically broken up. But, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's stronger now, much stronger. Everyone agrees on that. In fact, if you look at who the settlers are, the illegal settlers in the occupied territories, the ultra-religious ones they're way out of proportion to their numbers in the population. And for them, it's fine. If you live in the West Bank, it's like now when I go home, I'm going to a Boston suburb, okay? Nice Boston suburb out in the West, Lexington. Yeah, that's what the West Bank is. It's the nice, pleasant suburbs for Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Also happens to be sitting on the major water supplies and breaks up the Palestinian territories and so on. But and you can live there subsidized. I didn't get subsidized to move to Lexington, but if you move to the settlements in the occupied territories, the illegal settlements, you get subsidized. So you get a nice house, you know, a superhighway taking you right to the Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. You don't have to worry about Arabs because they can't be seen. They're off somewhere else. And you get paid for it. So sure, people move. And the religious settlers way out of proportion to their numbers. And there is an increasing growth of fundamentalism, not just there, but all over the world. I mean, Christian evangelicals have the kind of political clout now that they didn't have 30 or 40 years ago in the United States. Nothing like it. I mean, the numbers were about the same, but they weren't organized as a political force then. And in Israel, Palestine, on all sides, and in fact throughout the region, Islamic fundamentalism and Jewish fundamentalism are increasing. Part of the reason is understood, that's a great part of it. As far as Islamic fundamentalism is concerned, remember that's what the U.S. has been supporting all along. The most extreme Islamic fundamentalist tyranny in the world is Saudi Arabia. By comparison, Iran looks like a secular heaven, and that's the leading U.S. ally, and it's been the same elsewhere, and for good reason. The main enemy has been secular nationalism. That's dangerous. Secular nationalism can lead people to seek alternative paths of development, independence, and so on. So the U.S. has been supporting extreme fundamentalism. And in fact, as secular nationalism has been destroyed, as it has to a large extent in Lebanon too, both internally because of its internal, a lot of internal problems, but also externally by force, something replaces it. And what replaces it is quite often religious fundamentalism. I suspect that's partially true in the United States too. When you have a country where 80% of the population thinks the government is run by the few big interests looking out for themselves, not the people, and I can't do anything about it, people aren't just going to give up. They're going to turn somewhere else. And one of the places you can turn is to megachurches. These are phenomena that you see all over the world. One of the effects of the U.S.-run terror wars and murderous and national security states in Latin America has been a rise in Protestant fundamentalism. Actually, it's complex because in the 1980s, the U.S. was at war with the Catholic Church. But that's because the Catholic Church in Latin America committed a grave sin. They went back to the Gospels and took them seriously. They were a radical pacifist message, which you're not supposed to pay attention to. And they were organizing peasants to read the Gospels and think of what they mean and so on. So they had to be wiped out. And there was a two-pronged effort. The U.S. ran the violent side, the Vatican defrocked them and so on. And it did pretty much undermine them. And one of the consequences is a considerable rise in Protestant extreme fundamentalism. I mean, people don't give up when you destroy their hopes. They turn to something else. And yes, it's increased, to get back to your...
We thank you for coming. We hope you'll come to other lectures sponsored by the ADC. Thank you.